Good morning. Hope everyone had a happy and healthy holidays, and I guess we're headed to another holiday after this. With that, I'm Mark Blank. This is the Commissioner's weekly meeting for December 30th, 2024. Commissioner Plant, any preliminary comments?
Tis the season to holiday. No preliminary comments. I'm ready to approve the consent agenda.
Commissioner Gilman,
Good morning. Happy holidays again. I would also vote to approve the consent agenda.
as would I. Moving to proceeding number 23M-0217R, Ms. Terry, RTD Fall 2024 Audit Report.
Good morning, Commissioners. Happy holidays. This is Cindy Rose Terry, State Safety Oversight Engineer of the Rail and Transit Safety Section. I will be covering the findings from the semi-annual virtual and on-site safety audit number 4 conducted by the PUC staff. This audit is the fourth in a 3-year cycle of safety review of RTD's Public Transportation Agency Safety Plan. During the fall 2024 audit, 7 checklists were reviewed across 4 key safety management system areas: policy, risk management, assurance, and promotion. 1 non-compliance finding was identified, specifically concerning the safety and security certification project review. RTD's response to this finding has been prepared and submitted. Unless there are any questions, we will proceed with our recommendations.
That'd be great.
We recommend that the Commission approve the semi-annual virtual and on-site audit report dated November 21, 2024.
Commissioner Plant,
I agree.
Commissioner Gilman,
I also agree.
as do I, and that can be an ABC decision adopting the audit report. So thank you, Ms. Rose Terry.
Thank you so much.
Proceeding number 24AL-0438T, Mr. Branson.
Good morning, Chairman and Commissioners. Quest Corporation, doing business as CenturyLink QC, originally filed advice letter number 3171 on October 8th to increase the tariff rates paid by local 911 agencies from $752.22 per month per incoming 911 line at each 911 center to $776.47, an increase of $24.25 or 3.2%. The purpose of this increase is to pay for ongoing costs related to improvements to network diversity between the last serving central office and the 911 center in a significant number of communities across the state, intended to reduce the likelihood of service disruptions to 911 centers. The proposed effective date was March 1st, 2025. However, on December 4th, CenturyLink filed an amended advice letter proposing to change the effective date for the amended tariff pages to be December 20th, while keeping the actual effective date of the new rates at March 1st, 2025. The stated purpose of this proposed change is to provide the company with certainty about whether the new rates would be approved so that they could begin construction on the project and put into place the agreements with third-party transport providers to deliver the desired redundancy to the 911 centers. The second and third amendments to this advice letter were filed on the same day as the first and were essentially fixes to typographical and administrative errors in the advice letter and proposed tariff pages. In order to ensure that customers, which in this case are the local 911 agencies across the state, have sufficient knowledge of the change of the effective date and of the shortened window to file a protest with the Commission adopted an interim decision on December 11th, ordering CenturyLink to file a fourth amended advice letter, indicating that the effective date would be December 31st, and requiring that CenturyLink issue customer notice of the advice letter and the effective date, including instructions for how to file a protest letter. On December 13th, CenturyLink filed the required amended advice letter and declaration that it had sent the required customer notice to all of its customers, including a copy of the notice that was sent and a list of the recipients, which appear to be comprehensive of the local 911 agencies in the state. The amended advice letter also changed the actual effective date of the new charges from March 1st, 2025 to June 1st, 2025, giving the local agencies more time to prepare for the change in the rate. As of this date, no protests to this advice letter have been filed. The question before you today is whether to suspend the advice letter or to allow it to become effective by order of law. And with that, I will pause for your questions, then provide my recommendation.
Why don't you jump to your recommendation, and then we'll come back with questions, comments, or a vote.
Yes, sir. Because CenturyLink has met the requirements set forth in the interim decision requiring a new amended advice letter filing as well as the customer notice, and because no entity has filed a protest to this tariff amendment, advisors recommend the commission allow the item to become effective by order of law.
Commissioner Plant?
I agree with the recommendation.
Commissioner Gilman?
I also agree.
As do I. Thank you, Mr. Branson.
Thank you.
For proceeding number 24D-0534T, Ms. Rosati, 911.
Good morning, Commissioners. I'm Wendy Rosati of your Commission Council. On December 9th, 2024, a petition for declaratory order and alternative petition for rulemaking was filed by the Boulder Regional Emergency Telephone Service Authority, the Douglas County Emergency Telephone Service Authority, and the El Paso Teller County Emergency Telephone Service Authority, collectively the petitioners. The petition requests a declaratory order removing an uncertainty claimed by the petitioners with respect to Section 29-11-102.3, 1B of the Colorado Revised Statutes and Rule 2148, subsection A, Roman numeral 2B of the Commission's telecom rules, or in the alternative, request the Commission open a rulemaking proceeding to clarify and modify Rule 2148. Petitioners state there is currently a basic emergency service provider advice letter and tariff amendment before the Commission in proceeding number 24AL-0397T, and that the issues in that proceeding may include whether certain services introduced in the tariff filing should be optional or mandatory. Petitioners state that the parties' positions in that proceeding may depend on whether and how the Commission would determine optional services should be subsidized with proceeds of the 911 surcharge. Petitioners also contend that certain procedural and timing considerations under existing rules may inhibit the tariffing of optional services and implementation of services that are in the public interest. Therefore, petitioners request a declaratory order or alternatively a rulemaking, making clarifications to Rule 2148 to receive guidance on these issues. Under Commission Rule 1304, I, Roman numeral 2, the Commission may accept and entertain a petition for a declaratory order to terminate a controversy or remove an uncertainty regarding any tariff, statute, or Commission rule, regulation, or order. Under Rule 1306B, the Commission may accept a petition for rulemaking and set a schedule to receive comments on the petition from interested participants. With that background, I can pause for any questions or discussion or provide a recommendation.
No, if you can give us a recommendation, that'd be great.
I recommend accepting the filing as a petition for a declaratory order and alternative petition for rulemaking, and setting a 30-day notice, intervention, and comment period. After this 30-day comment period has ended, the Commission may take up the merits of the petition for declaratory order, including whether to grant or deny the request, or determine whether to direct a notice of proposed rulemaking.
Commissioner Plant?
I agree with the recommendation.
Commissioner Gilman?
I also agree.
As do I, and that can be an ABC decision, accepting the petition and setting up 30-day notice and comment period. So thank you, Ms. Rosati.
Thank you.
Proceeding number 24AL-0474E, Mr. Davis, Public Service Company of Colorado, TCA.
Good morning, Commissioners. I'm Ron Davis of the Commission's advisory staff. And for the first matter I'd like to present to you this morning, it's a short cleanup of the tariff filings for Public Service Company of Colorado's transmission cost adjustment to take effect January 1st. Recall that the company actually made two advice letter filings for its 2025 TCA. Under advice letter 1965 filed in this case, the company filed two tariff sheets tied to transmission investment cost recovery. The filing also included the standard components of all previous TCA filings submitted on November 1st for new rates effective January 1st. However, under a different advice letter, 1967, that was filed in proceeding 24AL 483E, Public Service filed 3 tariff sheets to modify the TCA terms and conditions, as well as the same 2 tariff sheets that were filed here, except that the TCA rates that were filed in the other proceeding are combined, recovering both the revenue requirement of 2025 costs of distribution activities pursuant to Senate Bill 24218 and the traditional transmission-related revenue requirement for 2025. At the December 18th weekly meeting, the Commission adopted an order allowing the TCA filed in the other proceeding to go into effect on January 1st. That decision will also provide guidance to Public Service regarding its 2025 spending on distribution activities and equipment to advance distribution activities pursuant to Senate Bill 24218. Last week, Public Service withdrew the advice letter filed in this proceeding because of the Commission's action on the other advice letter. And it also refiled from that other TCA proceeding the information the company provided in support of its transmission investments for recovery through the 2025 TCA. So for this item, the CWM minutes can simply reflect that Advice Letter 1965 Electric was withdrawn by Public Service on Friday.
Commissioner Plant,
I agree.
Commissioner Gutman,
Thanks. I also agree.
as do I. Anything else on this
No,
one,
that's
Mr. Purpose?
all we need to do. The weekly meetings will reflect that the advice letter has been withdrawn.
Thank you. Do you want to go to proceeding number 24AL-0481E, Black Hills TCA?
Right. So, like Public Service, Black Hills filed its 2025 transmission cost adjustment for effect on January 1st. However, in this case, trial staff of the Commission has filed a protest and requests that the Commission set the matter for hearing and suspend the effective date of the updated TCA tariff sheets. Black Hills explains in its advice letter filing that the TCA recovers transmission-related costs that are incremental to the transmission-related investments already being recovered through the company's base rates. If permitted to go into effect on January 1st, the 2025 TCA for Black Hills will result in an increase of approximately $4 million in the annual TCA revenue requirement from approximately $14.9 million to $18.9 million. Black Hills states that it made approximately $31 million of incremental transmission-related investments in 2024. That increased net plan in service by $17.4 million, and it caused construction work in progress to increase by $13.9 million. Black Hills estimates that this 2025 TCA will cause average residential customer monthly bills to increase about $1 a month or 1%, and the average small commercial customer monthly bill will increase about $4.50 or 1.3%. Black Hills also explains that when the new base rates are established in the company's current electric rate case, that is proceeding number 24AL-275E, certain past transmission projects will begin to be reflected in base rates, and the associated costs will no longer be recovered through the TCA. In its protest, staff asked the Commission to suspend the effective date of the 2025 TCA because, quote, the Commission may well seek to adjust or modify Black Hills transmission asset cost recovery and the methods to be used in the company's ongoing rate case. Staff explains that the Commission itself raised concerns and solicited comments from numerous witnesses regarding Black Hills' reliance on existing transmission rules and statutes, cost impacts to ratepayers, and the unevenness in annual transmission expenditures. Staff also states that the Commission sought input on possible alternative cost control metrics in whole or part that could initiate additional review and needs assessment for individual transmission projects. Staff acknowledges, however, that the Commission has yet to issue any findings or decision on Black Hills' request for transmission asset cost recovery or other base rate adjustments in the ongoing rate case. In response to staff's protest, Black Hills argues that staff fails to state any specific deficiencies or errors in this 2025 TCA filing. such as the sufficiency of the information provided by the company or concerns about the prudency of the included projects. The company asserts that its TCA advice letter filing complies with Colorado statutes, commission rules, and the company's commission-approved tariffs. Black Hills further states that staff provides no basis for the proposed suspension other than speculation that the commission may seek to adjust or modify the TCA in an unrelated proceeding. Furthermore, the company expects to reset the TCA at the same time base rates go into effect pursuant to a final decision in the other rate case proceeding. Black Hills concludes that suspending this 2025 TCA for the purpose of determining what impact the commission may or may not propose in another proceeding is without merit. So the issue before you now is whether to set Black Hills 2025 TCA for hearing and suspend the effective date of the TCA tariff sheets pursuant to statute, or instead to reject staff's request and allow the 2025 TCA to go into effect on January 1st.
So maybe I'll jump in first and just say I'm struggling with this, and mainly on the issue of what costs are eligible for TCA recovery, and just a little bit by background. Based on what we learned in the Black Hills rate case, it seems like the primary driver behind the rate increase request was T&D capital spending that grew far more quickly than sales and revenues, which appeared to be essentially stagnant. I also had concerns in the rate case that affordability and long-term rate impact issues may not have been as fully integrated into the company's T&D capital spending decision-making as much as the local community and perhaps this commission may have wanted. My further sense from the rate case was that the company intended to grow future T&D capital spending at a pace that was likely to be far greater than sales and revenue growth, thereby raising the potential for ongoing future rate increase requests. More specifically, on this TCA filing, I'm not clear whether staff believes that the spending contained in this filing is consistent with the statutory and regulatory approach limiting TCA eligible investments to the expansion of transmission facilities, or contains spending that may be in the more ordinary course of business. Staff underlined this expansion of transmission facilities language in its protest, but didn't really express a view whether the filing included investments that complied or not with this requirement. Although given the limited sales growth, I'm struggling to understand why we need to expand transmission facilities. Under these circumstances, I'd be open to suspending the tariff and asking staff and other parties to take a closer look at this spending, specifically what spending should be TCA eligible. But I'm really curious to hear what you guys think, and would just say that this suspension would be a change from our prior approach. But after going through Black Hills rate case, maybe change is needed. So with that, I turn it over to you, Commissioner Plant.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like we don't have, well, two things. Number one, I feel like we don't have a full picture of the eligibility of the things that are included here, and I think we would benefit from an evaluation of how these comply with the rules, and particularly the expansion language. And the other thing is, and I don't know if you guys have any perspective on this, but sort of like we're kind of a victim of the calendar here, where we have a rate, something that's like evaluating all these issues that's going to happen here, but the calendar falls here. So, and how do we generally resolve those kinds of timing issues? I don't know if it comes up frequently or not, but it seems like we're sort of a victim of that timing in this particular instance.
Commissioner Gilman, curious to hear your thoughts and where you'd like to go.
Yeah, so Chairman, is your thought to suspend it for hearing in order to better understand the actual expenses and kind of trajectory of those expenses? I guess, as I understand from your discussion, we're seeing expanded transmission costs from both of our investor-owned utilities, but a pretty significant difference might be that one is expecting significant growth, and in Black Hills Electric, we have not seen significant growth, and I'm not sure are really expecting to. So to kind of better understand what is driving a significant increase in transmission needs with no really increase in sales.
I mean, that may be beyond the scope of the TCA, and this is mainly 2024. As I understand it, it's all 2024 investment. It's backward looking. I think the purpose of suspension would be to see what should be TCA eligible and what should not be TCA eligible, and whether investments that are in the ordinary course of business are now being put into the TCA for accelerated in between rate case cost recovery. So I think that would be the primary focus of it. I'd love to have the broader discussion, but perhaps this is more narrow since it's just 2024 spending. Am I characterizing this correctly, Mr. Davis?
This filing is to collect project costs that were incurred in 2024.
Commissioner, go ahead, Commissioner Plant.
This is, and my concern is sort of related to the changes that we made in the TCA rules, where we specifically said that, to be included in the TCA, it would have to be an expansion of capacity and not just, as the chair was pointing out, costs that are incurred in the normal maintenance. I just don't know whether or not.
Right. So that would be the primary purpose of the expansion to suspension to have staff and the parties determine whether these are ordinary course of business or if it's truly an expansion in transmission capacity.
Yeah, and I recall those discussions from earlier this year. Some of them come back around. So I don't have any opposition to that.
Mr. Davis, does that give you what you need?
Yes. So the commission is going to set the matter for hearing to understand the nature of the costs incurred in 2024 being sought to be recovered through the 2025 TCA.
Yes.
Okay.
And exploring TCA eligibility.
And exploring TCA eligibility. Okay. Will this matter be referred to an administrative law judge, or will the commission be hearing this matter en banc?
Do you have any advice for us?
Well, the commission is setting this matter for hearing for reasons that are largely on its own motion. So I don't know why, what basis the administrative law judge would use for its review of this, other than what you've just said, whether to review this filing for conformance with the TCA tariff. If, for instance, the commission is looking to modify the TCA tariff to narrow the eligibility of projects, I'm not sure that there's enough information for an ALJ to know what the commission intends.
Would you guys be okay if we kept this at the commission level for now?
Yeah.
Commissioner Gilman?
Yes.
And would you establish a 30-day notice and intervention period?
We would, I think. Commissioner Plant?
Yes.
Commissioner Gilman?
Yes.
I agree.
Okay, so yes, now I have what I would need to draft an ABC decision setting this matter for hearing.
Thank you, Mr. Davis, for helping us get through this during the holidays. And I think that can be an ABC decision. Proceeding number 24AL-0496 Mr. Davis.
Sure. This one I'd like to present in addition to the next item, which is proceeding number 24AL-0497E. The cases involve the same subject, but they also involve two separate utilities. On November 15th, in accordance with the Commission's rules, Black Hills Colorado Electric and Public Service Company of Colorado each filed its tariff governing billing credits paid to subscribers of community solar gardens. These new credits would be effective January 1st. The Colorado Solar and Storage Association, the Solar Energy Industries Association, and the Coalition for Community Solar Access jointly filed a protest to both advice letter filings. They allege that these utility advice letter filings are inconsistent with the Commission's rules and request that the Commission suspend the effective date of the filed tariff sheets and hold a hearing regarding the proposed changes. For some background on this, Public Service and Black Hills are required by statute to offer a billing credit as the means of purchasing output from a community solar garden. House Bill 231137 amended that statute to allow for the CSG billing credit to take one of two forms. It can be a bill credit that changes annually, or it could be a bill credit that remains fixed starting at the time the subscriber organization applies for or bids capacity into a utility's community solar garden program. In June of this year, the Commission adopted rules to implement these new provisions governing the CSG billing credits. Rule 3881B codified the practice by which annual tariff filings are used to establish the CSG billing credits for each utility, and the rule requires an advice letter filing on or before November 15th for the new credits to become effective January 1st. When adopting Rule 3881B, the Commission clarified that each year the utilities tariff filing would set forth the billing credits applicable in the following year. The bill credits that change annually would be updated based on estimated values of the total aggregate retail rates to be in effect in the coming year and the prevailing costs to the utility to deliver, integrate, and administer the community solar gardens. And pursuant to the new statute, in addition to those annual bill credits, a fresh vintage of fixed bill credits would be set forth on the tariff to be made available during the following calendar year. The Commission further provided an example of how that would work. The utility's November 15th, 2024 filing would set the fixed bill credit available starting January 1st of 2025. And that would be applied from that time forward, starting when a subscriber organization directs the utility to provide subscribers to a CSG with a fixed bill credit. That vintage of billing credits would apply for the full life of that community solar garden. Then, on or before November 15th of next year, the fixed bill credit to apply for elections made in the next year, that is in 2026, would be added to that tariff sheet, and the new value of fixed bill credits to be applied from that point forward would be set forth for the public and for the community solar garden developers to understand. So the tariff sheets contemplated in the rulemaking would show in 2026 at least two sets of fixed bill credits, the 2025 vintage of fixed bill credits and the new 2026 vintage of fixed bill credits. The Commission explained in that recent rulemaking that this is the intended design of the utilities tariff, and it would be the primary way the utilities and the Commission will be able to consider the change in value to community solar garden customers of the fixed bill credit over time. The Commission also stated that the approximate 6-week window between the filing date of the tariffs and the effective date of the bill credits would allow time for stakeholders to address concerns prior to when the Commission might decide whether to set the matter for hearing. In their protest to the two advice letter filings, the solar parties allege that the tariff sheets are deficient because they do not set forth any approach to ensure the Commission is able to consider the change in value to community solar garden customers of the fixed bill credit over time. They state that the Commission did not prescribe any specific mechanism by which the utilities would set the billing credits, instead opting to allow this tariff filing process to be flexible enough to accommodate multiple possible ways to establish the fixed bill credits in accordance with the new statute. They fault the utilities' advice letter filings for not proposing any adjustment mechanism to ensure that the value of the fixed bill credit remains constant over the lifetime of a project. The solar parties thus asked the Commission to require the utilities to amend these tariff sheets to include an adjustment mechanism and to provide the necessary level of certainty for the developers to continue building community solar gardens. The solar parties also fault the utilities for failing to include in the tariff sheets earlier vintages of billing credits. They explain that the Commission's new rules provide that a fixed bill credit option will remain constant starting at the time the subscriber organization applies for bids or applies for capacity or bids capacity into the utilities program. They state that all CSG projects applied for or bid capacity into the utilities CSG programs prior to 2025, and some have yet to reach commercial operation. So according to the solar parties, the CSG tariff sheet must include fixed bill credit values for earlier vintages to accommodate such projects. So the decision for you now is whether to set these two matters for hearing before an ALJ and to suspend the effective date of the billing credits for 120 days pursuant to statute.
Do you have a recommendation for us?
Yes, I do. I recommend that the Commission set these matters for hearing, suspend the effective date of the tariff sheets, and refer the matters to an ALJ for recommended decisions. This would be two separate decisions, one for Public Services advice letter and the other for Black Hills' advice letter. I agree with the solar parties that the utilities billing credit tariff filings are deficient and fail to adequately support the updated and new forms of credits being made available to community solar gardens. This review is necessary pursuant to House Bill 231137 and pursuant to the Commission's newly modified billing credit rule. The Commission's, sorry.
No, keep going.
Okay, the decision should establish a 30-day notice and intervention period for each case. And again, those should be referred to an administrative law judge.
Commissioner Plant?
I agree with the recommendation.
Commissioner Gilman?
Also agree.
As do I, and that can be an ABC decision. Mr. Davis, you want to jump to the next one?
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sure. So the next one is proceeding number 24AL 498E, and this has to do with the tariff from Public Service Company of Colorado that sets forth the net metering credits that are offered to qualified customers with off-site distributed energy resources. And these rates would be effective January 1st as well. Public Service explains that the off-site net metering credit for 2025 is the product of the solar-weighted total aggregate retail rate, or SWTAR, less the fixed reasonable charge, or FRC. The amount of the credit for 2025 is a decrease of about 8% to 22% relative to the credit paid last year, depending on the customer's rate class. Public Service explains that the decrease in credits is due to increases in the company's base rates, and specifically the increases in transmission and distribution costs in the FRC. The tariff sheets filed with Advice Letter 1971 include only those that set forth the credit amounts and do not include the tariff sheets that show the methods used to calculate the net metering credit or other applicable terms and conditions. Public Service also filed no direct testimony with the advice letter, so it's a pretty bare bones filing. The Colorado Solar and Storage Association and the Solar Energy Industry Association jointly filed a protest to this advice letter. They claim the filing is inconsistent with previously adopted advice letters implementing the offsite net metering credit, and thus request that the Commission set the matter for hearing. For example, Costa Sia claimed not having sufficient access to material to fully understand the updated bill credit methods, and they state that they have not been able to fully review the key inputs to the SWTAR analysis, such as the company's solar impact study. They further raise concerns about key assumptions being made in the workbooks that Public Service provided to Costa Sia prior to their filing of the protest, COSACIA state that Public Service should explain how the pairing of energy storage with an off-site solar facility would impact the SWPAR calculation, because such facilities would be able to better match customer demand, in addition to better meeting overall system needs. In addition, COSACIA argued that the changes to the advice letter would increase clarity and understanding of the applicable credit rates for all stakeholders. The filing should be as robust and accurate as possible, setting forth the various credits reflective of the year in which an interconnection agreement was executed. So again, the question before you is whether to set for hearing these tariff sheets. I can make a recommendation if you'd like.
I think we'd like that, or at least I would.
Okay. Again, I agree with COSACIA that this filing is deficient in that it fails to adequately support the approach for determining these offsite net metering credits. The Commission should set the matter for hearing, suspend the effective date of the tariff sheets, refer the matter to an administrative law judge, and establish a 30-day notice and intervention period.
Commissioner Plant,
I agree with the recommendation.
Commissioner Goman,
I also agree.
as do I. And again, that can be an ABC decision, Mr. Davis. So thank you.
Thank you.
Proceeding number 24A-0442E, Mr. DeCenso, the Public Service Company, JTS, and extraordinary protection for certain information.
Yes. Good morning, Commissioners. Mitchell DeCenzo of your Commission Council. For your consideration today is Public Service's response to decision number C24-0941I regarding the motion for extraordinary protection of highly confidential information. For context, at the December 18th Commissioners' weekly meeting, the Commissioner took up several procedural issues that were included in the Public Service's omnibus motion. This included the company's motion for extraordinary protection. The Commission granted the company's request for extraordinary protection of information for 14 categories. For the 15th category, which includes other bid information contained in bid packages from the company and other entities, the Commission directed the company to file more information as soon as possible. On December 26th, the company filed a response stating that the information in category 15 includes bidder financial information, including certain cost and financing data, bidder equipment information and detailed operational projections, and bidder information relating to the permitting status, siting consideration, land use rights, and prior bidding experience. While the company continues to claim that this information is highly sensitive and deserving of strong protections, the company states that because bids will not be due until after the conclusion of phase 1 of the proceeding, this information will not appear in phase 1, including in discovery. The company proposes additional consultation with interveners to reach consensus on how to treat all or some of the information covered by category 15. Through this additional consultation, the company aims to explore how this bid information can be summarized and anonymized for the public to support transparency and public discussion during the phase 2 of this proceeding. The company proposes 2 paths moving forward. 1, the Commission could hold the MEP for category 15 in abeyance until the end of phase 1 process and direct the company to confer with interveners to present a consensus proposal or its proposal that can be briefed by parties concurrent with phase 1 SOPs. The second option proposed by the company states it is willing to partially withdraw its motion for extraordinary protection with respect to category 15, with the understanding that it would refile a more detailed proposal with the goal of reflecting greater consensus at the conclusion of phase 1. I can pause here for discussion or proceed to offering a recommendation.
Yeah, if you have a recommendation, that'd be great.
Council recommends the Commission take the second option proposed by Public Service and acknowledge that Public Service will partially withdraw its motion for extraordinary protection with respect to category 15, with the understanding that the company will refile a more detailed proposal reflecting greater consensus at the conclusion of phase 1. Council believes this option will be cleaner procedurally, and the Commission can properly consider the company's filing at the end of phase 1.
Yes, maybe I'll go to you first, Commissioner Goman. It seemed like you may have had more concerns with this. Are you okay with that approach? Further thoughts?
Yeah, certainly. Thanks, Mr. DeCenzo. Yeah, I think the second approach really allows us to get a more detailed proposal to actually understand what they're asking for, this protection for, as we conclude phase one of the process. So I'm happy with that approach.
Does that work for you, Commissioner Plant?
Yep, I agree.
As do I. And that can be an ABC decision, Mr. DeCenzo. So thank you.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Back to you, Mr. Davis. Busy morning. Proceeding number 24R-0192G.
Right, so now I'd like to present the Colorado Gas Utilities exception to Chair Blank's recommended decision adopting modified rules governing the gas cost adjustment. The revisions to the GCA rules are being made pursuant to certain provisions in Senate Bill 23-291. In terms of process, I'd like to set up the decision points derived from the exceptions, and then the discussion on each point would then start with Chair Blank. This GCA rulemaking was commenced pursuant to Section 4 of that new bill. The Commission is required to adopt rules to establish, quote, mechanisms that align an investor-owned utility's financial incentives with the financial interests of its customers regarding incurred fuel costs. These mechanisms would be in addition to other requirements in Section 4 of 291 that have already required each investor-owned gas utility to file with the Commission a gas price risk management plan, or GPRMP, to address the volatility of fuel costs recovered from the utility's customers pursuant to the utility's GCA filings. You'll recall that a gas price risk management plan was established for each of the 4 investor-owned utilities through application proceedings that concluded in November of last year. The Commission opened this proceeding and issued a notice of proposed rulemaking in April. The proposed revisions to the GCA rules set forth 2 primary elements. The first is proposed paragraph 4603G that incorporates the utility's gas price risk management plans as a permanent feature of gas cost recovery through the GCA. Proposed Rule 4607 establishes a new mechanism that shares as a financial incentive or penalty a portion of the decreases or increases in gas commodity fuel prices reflected in the GCAs. Notably, the amendments to the GCA rules replace the requirements for a gas performance incentive mechanism, or GPIM, that had just been established in proceeding 21R 314G with a new GPIM. Very briefly, proposed Rule 4607 defines the new GPIM. It calculates the difference in gas costs between a recently concluded quarter and the same 3 months in the prior year. It splits the portion of that difference in prices subject to a deadband, either as a cost borne by the utility shareholders when there is an increase in gas costs, and that would be the penalty, or as a share of the savings in the form of earnings for the utility shareholders, and of course that would be the incentive. Chair Blank's recommended decision finds that the GPIM framework defined by Rule 4607 reasonably aligns the investor-owned utility's financial incentives with the financial interests of its customers who pay the GCA. The decision goes on to state that the GPIM framework is most suited to satisfying the requirements of 291 when also implemented with the gas price risk management plans and most of the existing provisions in the GCA rules. Atmos Energy Corporation, Black Hills Colorado Gas, and Public Service Company of Colorado each separately filed exceptions to the recommended decision. In brief, all 3 utilities object to the historic baseline proposed to be used for the new GPIM. If the Commission maintains a GPIM, as would be established by the adoption of the recommended decision, they further seek clarification on elements of that GPIM, including the deadband, the cap on the incentives and penalties, and on the carry forward provisions when the utility's gas price risk mitigation plan is in operation. In addition, Atmos seeks additional rule language regarding force majeure and Public Service seeks a 1-year trial period for the GPIM before incentives or penalties are applied. The Colorado Office of the Utility Consumer Advocate filed a brief response to the utilities exceptions. It states its support for the recommended decision without modification. UCA argues that the recommended decision embraces the intent of 291. Durango Mountain also filed a motion for leave to file out-of-time exceptions. And with this set of pleadings, there are about 10 essential decision points that derive from these exceptions. In the interest of time, I'll present these decision points without a full recitation of the procedural history, participant positions, the recommended decision, or even the exceptions. But I am prepared to provide the background for that if you request it, or if it seems necessary to facilitate your discussion this morning. If moving on to the first decision point is what you'd like to do, I'm happy to do that.
Let me just, is it all right with you guys if we just jump into it? I would maybe like to share some broader comments in response to the exceptions. But before I do, just wanted to see if you're okay just jumping into the decision. So, Commissioner Plant?
Yes.
Commissioner Gumman?
Yeah, that works for me.
All right. Well, I guess, Mr. Davis, just a few thoughts before we go into the individual decision points. From a big picture perspective, the utilities seem very happy with the status quo of a forward-looking fuel cost using market indices with no incentive mechanisms and are strongly opposed to change. But for me, Senate Bill 230291 was enacted at a time when these forward-looking fuel indices were in place, and despite this, required us to, and I'm quoting now, establish mechanisms to align the financial incentives of an investor-owned electric or gas utility with the interests of the utility's customers regarding fuel costs. This legislation seems like it was a direct response to the sustained gas price run-ups over the last 9 months of 2022. And my understanding of the frustration that motivated the legislation was that customers experienced very large and unpredictable bill increases, while the utilities were essentially held completely harmless financially during this commodity price run-up. From this perspective, the purpose of the legislation appears to be to align utility and customer incentives such that if there were large future changes in natural gas prices, like in 2022, to a comparatively modest extent, the gas utility would do better financially when customers did better, and vice versa. As such, forward-looking industries did not and would not align incentives during an event like in 2022, but the backward-looking indices do create such alignment. Given all this, I'd like to suggest that we continue with a historical index approach in these rules. I think it's the only approach that has been implemented elsewhere that aligns incentives in this way during events like the 2022 gas price run-ups. At the same time, I've been going through the exceptions in more detail, which seem to have taken on a more concerned turn as compared to the hearing comments. So as we get closer to implementing these rules and they're spending more time with advisors and counsel, I'm increasingly sympathetic to the utilities' concerns about unintended consequences. Given all this, I have a couple of proposed modifications for your consideration that may allow us to move forward a little more cautiously. For one, I might suggest that we wouldn't apply the backward-looking index portion of these rules to the smaller utilities that say have more than 50,000 but less than 250,000 customers without a future utility-specific PUC process that would help us ensure that there weren't unintended consequences. Even with Public Service Company, I'd be open to its request to allow for the first year of the implementation of the GPIM to be a trial and reporting year, although the rules as proposed would be binding after a year. Again, this would give us some additional time to look at this mechanism and alter course if appropriate. As such, this approach would not apply these mechanisms to Atmos and Black Hills until we better understood the impacts based on our experience with public service and could explore it in a utility-specific process. This approach is also directly supported by the statute, which says the commission shall tailor the mechanisms to apply to different utilities based on a utility size or ability to implement the mechanisms. Finally, I have a number of thoughts as we go through the different 10 different decision points by commission plan. Any thoughts? What's your appetite for more aggressive versus more cautious approaches? I'm tending to be a little more cautious, but sticking with the historical approach. But really curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, well, first of all, I appreciate your taking on this issue in the hearing. It's one that I know that you guys dealt with just prior to my coming on the commission, and it was an
It's
issue of
just
some great consternation.
there's just no perfect answer. It's like everything is
Yeah.
like puts and takes. So I don't know. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, as I understand it, in reading through the issue, the utilities objections, pretty much each utility had the same objection to using a historic basis. And the argument was that they're punished for market costs of gas that are beyond their control, and the remedy for that is to continue to place the cost on consumer costs for market costs that are beyond their control. So from a principle standpoint, it's kind of at an impasse. So, that we're saying, the customers are saying we don't want to bear the costs of, these market issues that are beyond our control, and the utilities are saying we don't either. So, what I was curious about, and maybe you can address, the extent to which this was discussed during the proceeding, but if there was any consideration of establishing a process through the mitigation fund, I'm not sure if that's what it's called, but the sort of an insurance fund that's established through a buffer on the gas costs that's used to mitigate fluctuations in the gas price in the future. And my understanding is that the true-up of that fund wasn't specifically addressed, and it would basically fall to an advice letter. But what if we were to use the balance on that, the balance and the earnings on that balance, say out of whack, as an incentive to the utility to manage gas costs with a review on a set periodic basis? For example, every 4 years, the balance would be reevaluated based on a percentage of the fuel cost. And if it was positive, the company would retain earnings on the balance. If it were negative due to increases in gas costs, and the earnings would roll into the insurance, effectively going to the customer. It seems like doing that, you're basically providing an incentive, as the legislation said, providing a financial incentive to the utility to manage the gas costs. But you're also maintaining this sort of an insurance balance, looking at the overall price of gas and trying to mitigate the fluctuations, which I think is, the primary objective of the customers is, having this huge increase in costs is just very disruptive, and leads them to make, horrible prioritization decisions, whether or not to keep their heat on. So I was just wondering if that sort of an approach was discussed, or if there was any discussion really of that mitigation process.
I would like to phone a friend and see if Ms. O'Neill is out there. I know, I mean, I was hearing commissioner for the rulemaking, but you've been dealing with this for years, probably more years than you want to talk about. And then this has involved other negotiations, settlements, prior rulemaking. So maybe Ms. O'Neill, you can help us here.
Yeah, happy to. Good morning, commissioners. I'm Erin O'Neill with your fixed utilities section. So I think the distinction here that we're trying to make is that the sort of rainy day fund that was created for all of the gas utilities is very much a customer facing solution, right? The intent of that is to reduce the volatility that is experienced by customers, right? By putting a cap on the GCA and a floor on the GCA, and hopefully, and I think the situation we're in now, thankfully, is creating that sort of excess fund to use. But it really doesn't create an incentive for the utilities. There's really not an impact to the utilities. It doesn't align their incentive. It continues to keep them whole when they don't get their full costs. Those costs are recovery. Those costs are deferred with a return and then trued up later. So I think the intent or the distinction here is that rather than sort of the customer-facing mechanism, the intent of these rules is to try to address the incentives for the utilities and sort of create that skin in the game situation. And so the mechanisms kind of are intended to work together, where again, one is sort of that customer-facing experience and one is focused on the incentives for the utilities to try to manage those costs. So that's kind of the thinking and the distinction between these two things, and why this mechanism was put forward as something that does create that win-win. Gas prices come down, utilities manage those, lower costs. There's some bonus for them, and then the reverse when the costs run up. That isn't embedded in that sort of the gas price risk mitigation. There's so many acronyms around the GCA. If I try to say it, I'm gonna mess it up. So the rainy day fund is the vernacular.
What happens to the earnings on the balance of that fund?
It's a time value of money. So the earnings on that fund is intended to compensate the utilities for not having collected the costs that they legitimately incurred for gas costs. So there is symmetry there that they pay consumers an interest when they have over collected, which is a situation they have now, and they get compensated when they have been under collected. So that goes into that fund and is intended to sort of acknowledge the time value of that money. And again, that those for all the utilities, it's constructed similarly for that to be symmetric. When they have under collected, they get a return on it, and when they've over collected and sort of created that slush fund, they compensate consumers from holding their money and have a return on, pay into the return on that. And that would increase the balance of that fund, right? It just goes right back into the fund.
And that sounds exactly like what I was kind of describing. So is there a periodic review of where that fund is in terms of, every X number of years looking at a historic balance or whatever?
Yeah, yes and no. The GCA gets filed quarterly, and so staff does review the balance of sort of where we are with that, and the utilities have a cap on the total amount that would accrue in there. So I think for public service, it's $75 million at that's the limit. And once we have that, then it would sort of be fully funded, but for the return on it, that, it would stay at that level unless we needed it, in which case it would get drawn down. In theory, we could review that when we wanted to with the GCA, and we've been working closely with the utilities to manage that and monitor where they're at. And even for public service, the most recent one, they added an extra little, because prices are low, we've added a little adder to the GCA to try to continue to fund that fully and just kind of create that fund. But it is something we've been working very closely with the utilities on, is managing that, that fund.
Great. Thanks a lot for that explanation. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Commissioner Goman, you've been telling these issues for 4 or 5 years. Really curious to hear what you're thinking. Any guidance?
I wish I were enlightened by now, but I'm not. Yeah, well, first of all, I appreciate your work, and Ms. O'Neill's, Mr. Acero's, the folks who worked on this proceeding. I appreciate you trying to get somewhere. It really is kind of somewhat of the impossible problem that we're trying to solve here in aligning the interests. Yeah, having sat here through Winter Storm Uri and the price spikes, and then winter 22-23, which was really painful for customers. I wish I had a perfect idea on how we solve this problem at this point in time. it seems as though so many of the approaches, likely have unintended consequences or imperfect in whatever way, and yet we've been tasked by the legislature to kind of solve this impossible problem, right? I mean, and part of the problem is, just to be clear, I mean, this is a completely unregulated market. That's the plan. That's the design. It's not our plan. Like federally, that's how this works. That's how this goes on. I think there's no real chance it becomes regulated, right? And in essence, it's a market in which all the players up above charge the highest prices when people need it the most. Kind of the price gouging is a feature, not a glitch, as you're procuring wholesale gas, especially in the most dire of circumstances when customers' lives are on the line and have to have gas flowing, for better or for worse. Most of our economy, most of our buildings rely upon that gas in order to keep people warm, still at this point. So it's just such a difficult circumstance. And, I get the company's perspective through each of these events that they're not making a profit when the gas prices go up. They're also not facing any of the pain that the customers are facing. And that's been, I think that was the impetus, as I understand it, for some of this in the legislation, and I think presents just an incredibly flawed transaction whereby one party would like to make as much money as possible and the other party is agnostic as to the price, to their own purpose. There may be some moral reason they're trying to get the price low, but it doesn't harm them financially in the end. So yeah, I wish I had a perfect solution here. In essence, the gas markets operate so unpredictably and oddly to me that every baseline has these imperfect outcomes to it. There just doesn't seem to be a lot of rhyme nor reason to what to expect or when or what exactly leads to things. As I understand it, if we looked at, say, like a market-based approach, there are some absurd outcomes there too, right? Where I think some of our utilities would have earned a bonus while spending hundreds of billions of dollars on gas in excess of what's normal during Winter Storm Uri. Because technically, maybe they would have beat the market. Doesn't mean it didn't hurt customers, like the whole circumstance. So, and then obviously, there are shortcomings also to looking at it historically. So, yeah, I just wish I had more enlightenment at this point in time in trying to solve, what I think is a really dramatic problem in relying on gas, widely in the economy when the wholesale prices can be so unpredictable and swing so dramatically.
Well, what do you think about delaying the impacts on the smaller utilities to a future utility specific process, and maybe giving public service a trial year? Are you ready to jump into this now? I'm
So just so I
feeling
can,
a little more cautious. It was easier in the summer when this was further out, but any thoughts on that?
I mean, I'm generally pretty agreeable to like a trial approach. I think some of the rest of the details probably to be worked out as we continue to discuss. I mean, I think it's worth acknowledging, like, we don't have the perfect solution here, right? We've been dealing with this issue for years. It's really difficult to solve and come up with the exact right approach. So that to me lends itself very much to sort of a trial approach, no matter what the underlying methodology or direction is. I think a trial seems appropriate just given the circumstances that this is really a sticky issue. We haven't been able to come up with the perfect thing, in part because the baselines are so wonky and like it is a difficult issue to solve. So I would say, like, generally I like the trial approach. So your thought is you leave the rules saying it's a backward, but apply it for the time being only to public service in a trial approach, and then figure out through adjudications for the other utilities. But are the other utilities I mean, I'm just trying to think through if they really are the perhaps Black Hills at most, I'm not so sure, like differently situated in terms of their actual gas procurement sophistication and strategies and size of operation. You know, Atmos has very significant operations outside of Colorado. So I'm not so sure. Just looking at the number of customers inside Colorado gives us like a great view of the actual kind of sophistication involvement in the gas markets more broadly.
Fair enough.
I'm a little unsure of that. But I buy that like within Colorado, yes, their footprints are different. I don't know if you can really infer it's a smaller utility in total when we look at gas procurement. But would, I guess, if you were moving forward then and do those individual adjudications, would it be definitive then in the rule that it is rear looking and it's just an adjudication about how that applies, or is the adjudication to figure out if it's rear looking or not rear looking?
No, it would be rearward looking, but it would the adjudication would be if it applies to that utility. So the rules would retain the backward looking structure, but it wouldn't be applied to the smaller utilities until there was a future utility specific process. And even for a public service company, it'd be a year trial period before it would apply to them. But it would not need a future utility specific process to apply to public service.
And if, you know, the trial can go many ways, good, bad, not neither, I don't know. I just wonder if, like, if you get to those adjudications and determine to not apply the rear looking methodology, do you then end up with nothing, which may be worse than the adjustments the utilities are seeking now? I mean, they're going to put forth the same arguments, perhaps more data about how this trial goes. But I don't know if we wait to adjudicate until after the trial. It is like a significant delayed implementation for those utilities, which concerns me quite a bit given like the statutory directive to get this in place. So I'll probably want to kind of consider this with council. Maybe we take a short break and see where we end up. But I'm just trying to think it through in terms of kind of understanding your proposal more. I'm a little worried you end up with nothing, which could be worse than their proposal in terms of consumer protection. And I think what the legislation intends us to do. And the other thing I'm concerned about is it takes 2 years to get anything from now, which may also not keep the spirit of what I see in the legislation.
What do you think? Like, do you want 15 minutes, 20 minutes?
I think that'll work. I'm wondering, are there any of these other issues that would be good to talk through? I mean, this part is
I think that's good.
But like, are there any other things we want to figure out if there's like alignment or not on, notwithstanding that could influence some of the other thoughts and then break and talk to council?
I like that. Let's go through the 10 decision items and then we'll take a break. Commissioner Plant, did you want to jump in before we get to the decision items?
Yeah, I was just with regard to your proposal, is that the idea is that you'd set the rules in place, or be a trial year where you'd see sort of what the implications would be before it actually goes into effect. And during that period, is there an opportunity to receive recommendations that would be entered into the record? If by, I mean, the idea of a trial being that you would make modifications based on something if you needed to, but would there be a mechanism for?
Yeah, this was going to be my final comment, but I'll throw it out there now. I'd probably suggest we open likely an M docket sometime early next year and ask especially the smaller utilities to file analyses showing what would have happened if they were subject to the backward-looking fuel prices adopted in these rules, and then looking at the impact if it was backcasted for, say, the prior 5 years. I'd also like to see more data about the contemporaneous index proposed by Atmos and its impact both historically and going forward. So the idea would be to create a process to keep looking at this and exploring alternatives, including the one you suggested. So it would be to create. So there would be an associated process alongside this, along with individual utility reporting requirements and filings.
Okay. Great, thanks.
I have maybe another question. Okay. And I might have already asked you this, Mr. Davis, so you might already know. Regardless of if we go rear looking or contemporaneous, like market, I guess would be the other option. The actual details of like what baseline, what data, taken from where, taken when, letting other people see it, is that a separate adjudication that happens like after we finish these rules for each utility so that everyone's on the same page about how this works, like how it actually gets implemented? Or do we think it just gets implemented right away and there's enough here?
Mr. Davis?
During the course of this rulemaking, the utilities asked for utility-specific adjudications to identify the specific gas costs that would be subject to the GPIM. And so there is a rule in the filing requirements, 4602, it would be 4602H, that requires that each utility would include a GPIM in their GCA filings pursuant to the rule after the effective date of these rules. And so, I think based on the discussion in this rulemaking, it's very possible that there would be adjudications. If the recommended decisions rules were to take effect, I think it's likely that there'd be 3 adjudications on the GPIM to set out the details in each utility's GCA tariffs. And that process, if it was non-controversial, could be quick. And if it was controversial, that would require a full 250-day adjudication.
Okay. But it would probably get filed as part of a GCA, and then we'd have to figure out if we sever it or do something to move the GCA along, but suspend the GPIM part.
Right.
Okay. Thanks. Sorry. Just wanted to be clear what happens next in any case.
Mr. Davis, maybe you want to walk us through the 10 decision points. I'll propose resolutions. We'll have a discussion, and then maybe we'll take a break so my colleagues can talk to council and you.
Sure. Shall we stay with the proposed modifications to the GPIM mechanism?
Yeah.
Okay. So let's set aside now a decision on the exact benchmark that's being used. But assuming that there is a benchmark, the decision point is with respect to Rule 4607C that defines the sharing amount. And this is the amount of the difference that is the incentive or the penalty. The sharing amount is set in the recommended decision at 4% of the difference between the GCA and the GCA benchmark. The question is whether the Commission wants to clarify that the calculation of that sharing amount is not grossed up for taxes. This is also an opportunity for the Commission to discuss, I think, the merits of setting the sharing amount at 4%. During the course of the rulemaking, it has moved down from the NOPR where it was set at 5%. And in comments, the utilities have asked for something in the range of 2 to 3%. Again, the recommended decision sets it at 4%. And the specific question raised in the exception is whether that amount is grossed up for income taxes.
So I'd be fine with the clarification requested by Public Service Company that it should not be grossed up for income tax expenses. And I'd probably keep it at 4%, but open to going lower if you guys think it's appropriate, but I'd probably keep it at 4. Commissioner Plant,
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
Commissioner Gilman.
Yeah, I'm okay with clarifying that it's not a grossed up amount. I think it seems appropriate to keep it at 4. This may get wrapped up in our other discussion as we, come back and discuss the baseline. But it can't be an inconsequentially small amount, which I think is the biggest priority here to ensure that has a somewhat impact to try to influence the outcomes that we'd like to see.
So I guess Mr. Davis will keep it at 4, but not gross it up for income taxes.
Okay. Let's now talk about the deadband around that sharing amount. Atmos, Black Hills, and Public Service want to know how the deadband works, specifically whether the deadband applies only to the gas costs that are above or below the deadband. And so the question is, does the commission want to make that clarification?
I'd be fine with clarifying that the sharing mechanism only applies to the amounts above or below the deadband. Commissioner Plant.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's how we do most of the deadband stuff, right?
Yeah. Commissioner Gilman.
Yeah, I think that's fine.
Mr. Davis.
The next point raised in exceptions is with respect to the cap. The recommended decision sets the cap at an amount equal to 30 basis point return on the equity portion of the utilities rate base. There's a few decision points. The first is the one raised by Atmos and Black Hills. They want the cap that is at the 30 basis point return to apply to the utility at the whole, and that it be allocated to each of the different GCA areas or purchasing regions, and not be a 30 basis point return cap for each of those regions.
I'm fine with that clarification, Commissioner Plant.
Yeah, I agree.
Commissioner Gilman.
I agree.
Mr. Davis.
Okay. The next one with respect to the cap, it's in the recommended decision rules, it's a rolling 12-month basis that establishes that 30 basis point cap. Public Service asks that it be changed to a quarter cap in line with the quarterly filings. 30 divided by 4 is 7.5, and so they're asking for a 7.5 basis point per quarter cap instead of the 30.
I'd be fine with doing it on a quarterly basis as long as it keeps to the 30. Commissioner Plant.
Yeah, that's fine.
Commissioner Gilman.
Yeah, so Mr. Davis, I'm just curious, like on an annual basis, what's the impact of doing this, especially since gas costs tend to be very lumpy in the winter? I mean, you're very unlikely to see a giant run up in the summer. It could happen, or specifically
Happened in 2022.
shoulder seasons, so just trying to figure out like the actual impact of doing this. While like it sounds mathematically equivalent, I worry it's not at all mathematically equivalent because you actually see higher gas prices or the potential for gas spikes, particularly in one season.
That is, I think that's part of the intent of the recommendation in the exceptions, is that a 7.5 cap on a quarter may limit the amount of the incentive or penalty that would be calculated according to the GPIM.
Ms. O'Neill, I don't know if you're still out there and have any thoughts.
I am still here, but I don't know that I have any thoughts. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure. Is there there's a more specific question I can try to respond specifically?
Well, I was just trying to figure out like the exposure for the customers is primarily in the winter, right? We get a big
Yes.
price run up in the
The
winter. That's
usage.
when customers are going to get really hurt by higher prices. So I'm just trying to figure out how the sort of compartmentalization of the penalty and like a quarterly basis, like does that hinder this alignment that we're going for with customer interest? Because customer interest with regard to the price weigh very heavily in the winter. And to the extent that we sort of say, well, every quarter's worth the same as a penalty, that's not at all how it works for customers. So I'm just curious if we lose the alignment that we seek with this direction.
I guess clearly you are correct about the way that it works in terms of the exposure and the usage for customers. I guess maybe the question is the penalty high enough in the winter months for it to be meaningful? And then whether you treat it the same just to make it sort of easier for implementation, you could go either way. The question is that penalty amount high enough in the winter to result in meaningful attention from the utilities?
Yeah, I guess, Chairman, I go back to you. You heard the entire proceeding, and I respect that. So I guess to Ms. O'Neill's question is the penalty high enough in the winter to get the alignment we want? If we kind of compartmentalize it, even though customers are primarily paying that winter price.
I don't have strong feelings. I could keep the 30 basis points over the course of the year. Why don't we keep going, Mr. Davis, and we'll maybe come back to this one after our break.
Okay. As we talked earlier, the word pre-tax is causing some issues with the utilities. They want to make sure that the grossed up is not grossing up for income taxes is not used with respect to the penalty or incentive amounts, and likewise with the cap. So this is clarification that the cap also wouldn't be subject to gross up considerations.
I would support that clarification, Commissioner Plant.
I agree.
Commissioner Gumman.
I also agree.
Mr. Davis.
Okay, so those are the decision points derived from the exceptions that relate to the mechanics of the GPIM. During the course of the rulemaking, Rule 4607D was introduced, where a utility can request a force majeure exception to the GPIM for good cause shown. I think this would be like if there was another Storm Uri, and it made sense to, for some reason, address force majeure effects on the implementation of the GPIM. The question that's raised in exception is from Atmos, and that is whether to expand the provisions set forth as examples of force majeure events as being, or as including, the force majeure events as defined in the upstream gas supply, storage, and transportation agreements and tariffs that the utilities receive their service under from the interstate pipelines.
I'm amenable to that change, but Commissioner Plant.
Yeah, it seems
All right. Commissioner Gilman.
Mr. Davis, in this case, would this just be an update that they could try to bring that argument to the commission rather than some more automated outcome in terms of if there was force majeure further upstream?
Right. The rule
My
here,
understanding.
4607, let me see here. Just a section. I want to make sure I get you the right rule language.
I'm trying to pull it up too. Okay, I think I have it here. The utility
Yes.
may request and the commission may grant a force majeure exception upon good cause shown after such an event has occurred. The force majeure exceptions would allow the utility to exclude costs from the GPIM that are deemed to be associated with the force majeure event as defined by the utilities tariffs on file with the commission.
Yes. Yes. So what Atmos is asking for is that last sentence be amended to include force majeure events as defined by the upstream pipelines tariffs. But as you asked, yes, the idea of this rule is that the utility could ask for the suspension of the GPIM because of a force majeure exception.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a little weary here because of some of the upstream force majeure things, charades, whatever went on in Winter Storm Uri. But I mean, if it all comes before the commission in order to determine the appropriateness, I think that's probably fine. I just, in looking at the language of that that rule subpart, not to be like making us more problems, but the first sentence says is all mays. You know, they may request and we may grant. The second one has a will, and I just wonder if that should just be a may as well. But the force majeure exception may allow the utility to exclude costs. I mean,
Oh, I like that.
It's all a hypothetical upon approval by the commission as to the exact circumstances associated with the force majeure. So perhaps the deal I'm willing to strike is to say, yes, sure, they could come with a proposal that includes other more peripheral force majeure situations, but the second sentence is also a may. None of this is definitive at this point. This all requires some presentation of the facts and commission approval as to the actual exception.
Commissioner Plant, you okay with that?
Yeah, I'd support that change.
As would I. Mr. Davis.
Okay. Rule 4607E prescribes how the amount is accounted for in the GCA quarterly deferred balance. The decision point here relates to when the gas price risk management plan is in effect and being implemented vis-a-vis the GCA's deferred balance. Of course, that's where there's a floor or a cap that causes GCAs to be less volatile from the customer's perspective. What happens to an incentive or a penalty when the cap or floor is in place is the question here. What is being asked from the utility is a symmetrical treatment of that. In other words, the commission should either remove the expiration of carried forward incentives, or in the alternative, the carried forward penalties should expire the same way that the rules in the recommended decision have the incentives expire. So it's consistent symmetric treatment is the question that comes from the exceptions. And again, the commission can remove the expiration that's there and it would be symmetrical, or it could cause the penalties to expire in addition to the incentives.
I'd be okay with keeping it symmetric, but Commissioner Goman, I'll go to you first on that gas stuff.
Yeah, I mean, like in theory, I think in a perfect world, we make it symmetrical. I mean, I'm a little tortured by the circumstance in which they don't get through, like if you're having, sorry, I have to think it through again. I like had it in my mind how this works. But essentially, it could, I mean, it all could work imperfectly, so I don't know if it's like super ideal, but I think in theory, the symmetrical could work better.
Commissioner Plant?
Yeah, I think it works symmetrical.
I'm good with that too.
Okay,
Mr.
so
Davis?
by symmetric, does that mean that there's going to be no expiration, or does that mean there's going to be an expiration on both incentives and penalties?
I'd probably do no expiration. Would that work for you, Commissioner Goman?
Yeah, I'd go no expiration. I think the circumstance I'm thinking of, Mr. Davis, that was like concerning me was the only way that I could see a utility does not get their whole incentive or like burns up the clock before they get their incentive is probably if gas costs are at the maximum of that GCA band, right?
Correct.
Which is like, it's a morally troubling circumstance in that customers are paying the maximum that is allowed in the GCA and the utility still gets some incentive. It doesn't feel great. I think was the circumstance I was thinking, but you know, I think I can go with symmetrical with no expiration, but in some cases the consequences could be non-ideal here.
Mr. Davis?
Okay. I think what I had listed in my briefing materials for you as a discrete decision point was the trial period. And I think there's already been some discussion about that. So I think there's only one more decision point for me to present, and that has to do with Durango Mountain's motion for leave to file exceptions out of time. I recommend that you grant that motion and exempt small propane utilities from the gas price risk management plan requirements.
I support that and think it's consistent with the statute. Commissioner Plant?
I agree.
Commissioner Goman?
I also agree.
And I think there's one more decision point, Mr. Davis.
And what does that involve?
It's the length of the historical average. The rules talk about a 1-year average, and the utilities asked for another, and we did spend some time looking at that and have a suggested change.
Okay, sure. So before we break to talk about what benchmark is going to be adopted, the discussion here is on whether the if a historic benchmark is adopted by the commission, should it be a single year value, historic measure, or should it be an average as recommended by Public Service as its alternative to its primary recommendation to have an index-driven benchmark.
Right. And I just say after some additional historic analysis conducted by commission staff and in direct response to the Public Service Company exceptions, I'd propose a 3-year rolling historical average benchmark instead of a 1-year. It looks like this approach seems to provide a more robust baseline and greater stability. So I don't know, Ms. O'Neill, anything you'd add to that?
No, I mean, I think that the concern is understandably that like the starting point matters a lot, and whether we happen to be at a randomly low gas price period or randomly high, just, it's sort of how do we start a process, as well as, making sure that it's a sort of stable, not super volatile time period. So I think we felt like a longer sort of look back made more sense and was a little bit, more consistent. You get a more better representation of what the sort of long-term average gas prices look like, and that makes a better starting point than a single year look back.
So would you be okay with that change, Commissioner Plant?
Yeah, I'm just curious, Ms. O'Neill, I'm sorry.
She's trying to get away.
Is that what we use for the basis of the price that creates the risk management fund as well, or how do we base that number?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So my recollection is that we actually used a little bit longer a period of time, that it was sort of what's the highest we've experienced over I think it was at least a 5-year period, but that's a little bit different question, right? Like this is trying to get sort of what is a typical or average baseline, whereas that was explicitly trying to understand what do the tails look like how high and how low it can be. So I think having a longer look back made sense for that, of trying to understand sort of what are the bounds. And then also had just looked specifically at the big run up in 2021, 2022, and wanted to make sure that that mechanism would have been enacted in that time period. So that was a lot of how we looked at it for each of those utilities, sort of little longer time period, and making sure that it was a meaningful amount, given that historical volatility, where this is a little bit trying to set what is a more typical sort of long-term gas price to start as a baseline.
Okay. Thank you for that explanation. Appreciate it. Yeah, I'd agree.
Commissioner Govan?
I think notwithstanding the broader discussion on historical or not, which is not entirely settled, I think, if it were historical, I would be agreeable to this approach, I guess, before we get to the final discussion.
How long a break would you like, Commissioner Govan?
I'm okay with 15 minutes. I don't know if anyone else needs to talk to advisors or council, which might just prolong the break. So up to you all. If you need time, we might need to factor that in.
Commissioner Plant?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'd like to talk to advisors, but I think it'll be fairly brief.
I mean, maybe
All
we
right,
can
let's
do 20 minutes total or something, and Commissioner Plant and I have to feel it done.
Yeah, let's come back at 11 a.m. Does that work? All right, thanks.
Chair Blank, I think we're gonna need like another 10 minutes.
All right. Let's come back at 11:15.
Thanks.
Thanks. Mr. Acera, do we need a few more minutes if you're out there, Mr. Davis?
Yeah, we're gonna need probably another 5 minutes.
All right, do you want to reconvene 11:25? 11:25?
That works.
All right. We're back. Why don't Mr. Davis, do you want to start us off, or should I go with Commissioner Gomez?
Perhaps start with Commissioner Gilman, and then talk about it some more. And if there is some elements in that discussion that I could help with to suggest some specific rule changes or additions, then I could present it that way. Does that work with you, Commissioner Gilman?
Yeah.
I think back to you, Commissioner Gilman, wherever you'd like to go.
Happy almost afternoon. Okay. So just thinking through your proposal to take the baseline, and I think some of the kind of shortcomings that I at least viewed in it, especially with regard to the smaller utilities. I have a suggestion to consider as like a modification to that approach. So starting with your approach of utilizing the historic baseline for public service due to the significant differences in kind of their size and purchasing operations and likely, ability to actually interact with the market in that way. We could move forward with them with the historical baseline, move forward with Black Hills and Atmos with the market concurrent approach for the time being. I think I very much favor that to nothing, which I worry could be a consequence of the other approach. Each would move to their own adjudications, as I think is kind of the setup here to actually put in enough detail to implement this approach going forward. Then what I would suggest, perhaps instead of a trial in which there is no consequence, there is no outcome, which I think kicks us even further kind of years down the road before we have something in place that really actually does this kind of sharing that the statute suggests needs to be done. I would suggest that we require within 6 months after the conclusion of the first full heating season in which their GPIM is in operation, that we have them come in with an application for modification of the GCA GPIM in order to determine the best path forward in a more durable way. So it's in essence, like rather than a trial where there are no outcomes, I also worry if that could cause some perverse outcomes and consequences. I mean, we're tallying up math, but no one has any consequence or incentive based on it. It's not maybe my favorite approach. So this would set each of the utility sizes on a track where they do have a GPIM that will be implemented, differentiated by size, with some of the details to be worked out in the initial adjudication, that will survive an entire heating season with it in place. And 6 months after the conclusion of that, have an application in which we could really have all of the data and evaluate if we should sunset it, if we should move one from a historical to market or vice versa. So that's kind of my thought on how we might be able to move forward, given all of the moving parts, given my concerns with, the potential for that your path unmodified to maybe lead to nothing for the other utilities, which was a bit concerning to me.
So you're suggesting we'll have the rules go into in place, I guess after the conclusion of Triple R for Public Service Company, and then there'd be an application filed sometime in 2026 to sort of review what happened and see if there were unintended consequences. So that's what you're proposing for Public Service Company. Is that correct?
Well, I think you need that initial adjudication, unless I'm wrong, Mr. Davis, to kind of set the exact parameters to even get it in place. So it seems as though nothing meets the timing to be in place by the entirety of next winter season, at least as I'm seeing it, like in the rules and in my understanding of how this will go. So then the first time I expect the GPIM will actually be in place would be, let me do my math right, 26, 27 winter. So I
Yes,
believe summer 2027 winter would be a second adjudication to evaluate for each utility. Their GPIM would have been in place at least one full heating season to then evaluate. Now, those adjudications will take time, so that initial GPIM may well be in place a second heating season as that second adjudication, like at the end of this kind of initial sunset period, takes place.
Mr. Davis, can you sort of help us better understand, or can counsel or Ms. O'Neill help us better understand what that litigation would look like?
Sure. In the recommended decision, 60 days after the effective date of these new GCA rules would be the deadline for the filing of an application by each of the gas utilities to implement a GPIM through their GCA filings. So that the timing of that application proceeding would influence when a GPIM would be established for each of the three utilities. That might be before the 25-26 heating season. It might be in the middle of the 25-26 heating season. So that's how it would be launched. I think the way if I understand correctly what Commissioner Gilman has proposed, that application filing that would come 60 days after the effective date of the rules would be for public service, a GPIM that is closer to what's in the recommended decision with a historic benchmark. For Black Hills and Atmos, that GPIM would be based on the rules that were promulgated in the earlier rulemaking. And then once that GPIM was implemented, perhaps for a full heating season, then there would be a filing made by each utility to review the GPIM and determine the specific benchmark approach that is established in the rule, which of those benchmarks would apply going forward, and any other modifications that are necessary. So what this would do is this would put in place a GPIM in line with the timeline anticipated in the recommended decision here. It would implement two kinds of GPIMs for at least a period of time, and then would require some further commission review in the future after this GPIM is actually applied in practice.
Do you have any guidance or thoughts on this approach?
This approach? Well, this approach,
Commissioner, it sounds like it's what was in the recommended decision and the rules for public service company. Well, go ahead.
Well, I think the modification that may be made for public service company is that this would be a 3-year historic benchmark instead of a single-year historic benchmark.
Okay.
What would be new to the recommended decision would be, again, the requirement for Atmos and Black Hills to implement a GPIM in accordance with the existing rules. And what would be new is this future review after a full heating season has been completed with a GPIM implemented.
Ms. O'Neill, would you have anything to add before I turn it back to Commissioner Plant?
No, I think the only thing I would add is that, this, to the extent that I think part of the intent of what you had introduced or discussed this morning with the trial concept was to try to get a little bit of history and understand how some of these things might play out, that doing this sort of two-pronged approach, I think, would give you more information about that, right? You'd have certain people on the sort of forward-looking index PIM and one on the and somebody on the historical, and that you'll see the results and actions that are taken under both of those. So I think it accomplishes that objective perhaps even better, right? Being able to sort of see and observe what happens under different structures, and does leave something in place for the other two utilities. So I think it has, a number of benefits.
Commissioner Plant?
Yeah, I was gonna say, ask that same thing what Ms. O'Neill just said. It's basically the trial. It's basically the trial approach, but done within a structure of making an application for a new one rather than having a trigger of something going into effect at a date certain. So it's it's basically putting in that trial. On the dates, I just I know we always try to figure out what these the dates are. So this would get the GPIM in place for Excel for the 25-26 heating season. And then there would be a filing, and that filing may be in effect in the 26-27 heating season, but the results of that filing may be in effect for the 26-27 heating season, but it's also likely that that could then not be in effect until the 27-28 heating season. Is that correct? I mean, once they make a filing, I think we said 60 days after the end of the heating season, which is March. So the filing would be in May.
Mr. Davis?
So each one of the utilities is going to file a GPIM application to change the GCA tariffs. That will be filed 60 days after the effective date of the rules in this proceeding. That case will potentially go a full adjudication and maybe briefer. And after that adjudication, then the GPIM will be established in accordance with these rules for each one of the three utilities. So that's the very first set of adjudications.
So they would file in this upcoming May in 25.
Yes, each utility is going to file to implement the GPIM according to one of the two kinds of benchmarks that would be established in the rule, okay? And the utilities don't have discretion on which of those benchmarks. Public Service will file a 3-year historic benchmark GPIM. Atmos and Black Hills will file one in accordance with the existing rules. At the end of that adjudication, the GPIM will start to be implemented. That may be in the middle of the 2025-26 heating season. I've proposed that there be a rule that after a full heating season has been completed, the utility will file a new application to continue the GPIM, modify the GPIM, change the benchmark, and that adjudication would take advantage of all the information collected while the GPIM established by these rules has been implemented. Maybe that's for 1.5, 1.25, 1 3/4 full heating seasons. But in the future, the key feature of this approach is that it addresses Commissioner Gilman's concern that there be this period where there's no GPIM in place. There will be a GPIM in place at all times at the end of the adjudication that begins next year.
Okay.
And
I just say to Commissioner Plan, sorry, it varies from like the trial that was suggested, I think, by Public Service, and that I believe that was kind of a consequence-free trial. This is not. This would actually be active at the end of the first adjudication with whatever incentives or penalties come with that. It just has a natural reevaluation period to say, are we on the right track? We've tried it. How did it work? So there's a communication. This particular style for each utility is not necessarily permanent. And we should reflect that, in how we finish out the rules, that we could evaluate what baseline is being used, what methodology for each of the utilities in that second adjudication after we have the experience of the GPIM being in place for each.
So we have the first adjudication that begins with an advice letter in May, or with the filing of a PIM in May. How long does that take? I mean, would that be in place for the winter heating season starts in November, or no?
It depends on how much litigation there is around the details to implement the GPIM framework that's outlined in these rules. It could potentially take 250 days if
So
it's
worst
highly
case
controversial.
scenario is they have to file at the end of the next heating season and they haven't actually done anything because everything's still in adjudication.
But that's
Sorry, I think the plan is they would do that second filing, that second application to modify the GCA, GPIM at the end of the first full heating season in which it's been in place. So
Okay.
if by chance we are fine in 25, 26, it's in place the whole time, you would have that adjudication summer 2026. If it were not, and that was a partial or not at all, or I feel like Mr. Davis has a magic 250-day calendar that I don't have, like some sort of slide rule that tells him. But if you didn't, then it would be the following summer. So I just wanted to make sure we captured an entire heating season, and it's a little unknown how long these first adjudications will take.
Gotcha.
Mr. Davis, does this give you what you need to draft a TBC set of rules and decision? And what's the deadline for getting this out?
the deadline for us to get this decision out is that it needs to mail on the 6th of January. So I do have what I need, if you agree, Chair Blank, to this approach, I do have what I need to craft the rule. It's basically adopting the rules in the recommended decision, not striking the rules that were there already for the GPIM, and instead having those apply to Black Hills and Atmos, to revise the rules in the recommended decision with the historic benchmark approach to be applicable initially only to Public Service Company of Colorado, with the various modifications that we walk through in consideration of the utilities exceptions. So it really is the introduction of two new rules and clarifying which benchmark is to be used for the GPIM for each of the three utilities. So yeah, it's possible for this to be written and issued in time.
Okay, and then we'd have triple R in sort of the normal course of business.
Yes, right. The order adopting rules will be subject to triple R. If that happens, then the commission will take up the applications for triple R. It will issue a new decision that may adopt further revisions to these rules. This all pushes out when that 60-day deadline is to file a GPIM application. So, but all of that squares with the procedural requirements that we must abide by to promulgate rules.
All right, no, this is good for me, and I appreciate you both willing to take another look at this. The utilities are claiming all sorts of unintended consequences, and we appreciate moving forward with all three of us taking this on. So thanks to you both. And I'm comfortable moving forward with us. So any final thoughts before we go to the ECA?
Nope.
Commissioner Goman?
No, nothing necessarily. I think just, I'll be interested. We're gonna do a TBC, Mr. Davis,
Well,
or no time.
it would be easier to do this ABC if you are satisfied with what I described as the addition to the rules and how this approach would be implemented. It would. I have enough discussion here for it to be crafted as an ABC, but I'll leave it to you if you want to review that.
No, I think
Uh,
that's fine. I just want to try and like recognize the uh flexibility after the second adjudication that the baseline and methodology could change. So I think so long as we're on the same page with that, like I don't want to shoehorned in on something we don't intend to be, in that the same baseline, same methodology applies to the same utilities forever. I think the purpose of the second adjudication is to determine, is it appropriate? Is this what we intend? So like with that understanding, I'm okay with it. I just want to make sure you can craft it flexible enough that it meets our intent here.
Mr.
I
Davis.
understand that, and I can craft that decision.
All right, if you want to do this ABC, that's okay with me. Is that okay with you, Commissioner Plant?
Yeah, the only thing I would add is that when the companies that are keeping the sort of existing rule submit their application for the updated gas PIM, that that their application be designed specifically to achieve the objectives as articulated in the statutes of sharing the financial reward and punishment.
Mr. Davis?
I understand that, and I can make sure that's part of that new rule.
Mr. Sarah, anything else on this before we jump to the ECA?
Yeah, perhaps my notes are wrong, but I think we never got a final decision on the rolling 12-month cap. There was a discussion about whether it should be 30 basis points across the 12 months or whether 7.5 per quarter. And I think we tabled that. And because public service is going to have this sort of historical baseline approach applied to it, I think we need a decision on that, unless Mr. Davis disagrees.
No, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Sarah. I do think the commission should decide whether it's a 30 basis point rolling average cap, or rolling cap, sorry, or versus a 7.5% quarterly cap.
I'm okay with the 30% annual. Commissioner Goman?
Yeah, I would generally prefer that. I mean, if somebody's got something really compelling to bring us in triple R, I'm sure they will. But I'm just concerned that dividing it quarterly as if it's symmetrical every quarter in terms of risk to customers is not an accurate view of the situation. So absent any more compelling kind of arguments or information, I think the 30 basis points rolling average is more appropriate.
Commissioner Plant?
Yeah, I agree.
Mr. Davis, Mr. Acera, does that give us what we need on this one?
I believe so.
Yep.
All right, you want to jump to the ECA, Mr. Davis?
Sure. So this ECA rulemaking in 410E was opened at the end of September. The proposed rule are again intended to meet the requirements of 291 for there to be a symmetrical incentive mechanism that aligns the financial incentives of the electric utilities in this instance with the interests of their customers regarding incurred fuel costs. The specific proposed mechanism in the rules attached to the NOPR introduced the gas commodity fuel performance incentive mechanism. We call this the eGPIM, and it mirrors the GPIM that was just discussed. In addition, Senate Bill 291 requires the Commission to consider mechanisms to improve electricity production cost efficiency while minimizing fuel costs pursuant to 43-122A. The NOPR thus adds a new section to the rules entitled Electricity Production Cost Efficiency. Both of the Colorado investor-owned electric utilities object to this proposed EGPM. They also oppose the adoption of the provisions on the electricity production cost efficiency. And as in the GCA rulemaking, the Colorado Office of the Utility Consumer Advocate generally supports the EGPM as set forth in the NOPR and anticipates that the final adopted rules here will reflect any of the modifications to the EGPM as proposed in the NOPR for the GCAs. UCA is, however, silent on the rules for electricity production cost efficiency. The Colorado Energy Consumers, a group representing Public Service's largest electric customers, oppose the adoption of the EGPM in this rulemaking proceeding, arguing that the Commission should take additional time to evaluate alternative rules better tailored to the unique circumstances of the electric utilities, rather than model rules after a GPM for the gas utilities. CEC also explains that unlike the gas utilities, which are bound to rely upon gas supplies alone, electric utilities have substantial degree of control over their resource mix, supply, and dispatch. In other words, CEC argues that electric utilities enjoy better optionality in optimizing a mix to ensure reliable power, keeping costs reasonable, and the like. CEC also suggests that the Commission not adopt the provisions for electricity production cost efficiency, echoing some of the reasons put forward by the utilities. I'll try to make this presentation as brief as possible. I'll go through the rules more or less in order to set up decision points for votes, but I'm going to make two deviations from that plan. The first, I'd like to take up the disliked rule addressing electricity production cost efficiency. And then I'd like to take up the question raised in the NOPR, where the Commission solicited comments as to whether fuels other than natural gas should be subject to the incentive alignment required by 291. So if that's all right, I'll move to the first point, and that is this proposed rule that addresses electricity production cost efficiency. As I just mentioned, under there's a new section under this rule heading. It's Rule 3863. It's intended to satisfy the requirement in 40-3 123A2 that the Commission consider mechanisms to improve electricity cost production efficiency while minimizing fuel costs. The proposed rule has three parts. Part A says that the Commission is expecting utilities to use economic dispatch of their electric generation facilities to minimize fuel costs. Part B ties the Commission's review of generation resource cost efficiency in an ERP or electric resource planning context, so that would set a baseline that could be used to evaluate the prudency of fuel usage in a subsequent cost recovery proceeding. And Part C is intended to support the development and implementation of additional performance incentive mechanisms, or PIMs, to ensure economic dispatch and the minimization of gas commodity fuel costs. Public Service argues that this rule is unnecessary and it should not be adopted in this proceeding. It argues that the Commission should instead focus on the proposed EGPM to satisfy the requirements of 291. Public Service also states that it would be premature to adopt such rules without more thoughtful analysis and comments. Black Hills similarly asks that the Commission strike the rule in its entirety. It objects to tying actual performance to assumptions used in resource planning. Black Hills also warns that its future participation in organized wholesale markets would be complicated by a rule governing economic dispatch of generation resources. As I mentioned before, UCA is silent on this, but CEC encourages the Commission to delete the proposed rule. CEC argues that utilities must take accountability for prolonged uneconomic operations, but the terms of the proposed rules are too undefined, and the framework surrounding related disallowances needs more robust and thoughtful development. CEC points out that these topics are an area of disagreement already in Commission proceedings. CEC agrees, though, with many of the premises here, but cautions that nuances on how best to achieve these objectives requires more deliberation, more input, and more data. So the first decision point is whether to adopt Rule 3863, and I can provide a recommendation if you'd like.
That'd be great, Mr. Davis.
I recommend that the commission not adopt the rule. I agree with utilities and CEC that these concepts require further development before any rules addressing such concepts are promulgated. This doesn't mean that I think that economic dispatch of generation resources is not important. It's important to avoid the costly dispatch selections by utilities, particularly when the ECA is a cost pass-through mechanism. However, this rule should not be adopted in this rulemaking based on the thin record presented.
Sounds right to me, Commissioner Plant.
Yes, I agree.
Commissioner Gellman.
Thanks, Mr. Davis. Yeah, I agree in this situation, but I very much appreciate kind of the intent to have something to look at economic dispatch. So given the thin record here and kind of our inability to implement a rule based on this record, where might be a reasonable place to pursue this further, to kind of develop a record that would allow us to actually be, is it within, you know, the actual ERP proceedings, or elsewhere? Just trying to figure out if the intent is right, we just need more record, need more details to get it right. Where and when might we do that?
Well, I think it would be a future rulemaking. I would recommend that there be stakeholder outreach prior to the development of any NOPR on this. These are not new concepts. These were concepts that were raised when the commission had been considering potential modifications to the electric resource planning rules. There was concern, there's always been concern that resources are being acquired or existing resources are being used in ways that significantly deviate from how we expect them to be used in a resource planning context. You know, what we don't like are gas peakers used as baseload supplies because that's very expensive in terms of incurred fuel costs, and those costs are simply passed on to ratepayers through the ECA. So to answer your question, I think a subsequent stakeholder outreach on how to promulgate rules similar to this, but to develop them in a much more robust fashion is the way to go. And then potentially a new NOPR to expand the ECA rules that have to be adopted here in accordance with 291, but perhaps the requirements today are like Public Service suggests, to focus on the EGPIM.
Okay, thanks for that. Is it feasible to look at standalone PIMs within an ERP context to try to align actual performance to the anticipated and intended performance?
Well, that's also something that's on my mind here, is that the commission has directed Public Service to implement operational PIMs for facilities. That I think would be very instructive to a future rulemaking. I think those operational PIMs are for new resources. What we learn in the development of those PIMs might be applicable to developing PIMs for existing resources as well.
Okay, and perhaps could be of interest to me in my lifelong quest to get cost efficiency of carbon reduction PIM, which like involves all of these decisions. Did we get where we were trying to go in the most cost effective way possible? So perhaps that's part of my lifelong work here.
Maybe term long. Mr. Davis, does that give you what you need?
Yes. So I'll turn out to the next question, and that is whether there should be rules here that address fuel costs other than the costs of natural gas commodity. Really, only Public Service took up the invitation to provide some guidance here. Public Service says that it would not be appropriate because of the timing of the acquisition of the other fuels. Public Service was also frank that it didn't have a time really to devote to thinking about alternative PIMs that could apply to fuels besides natural gas in the short amount of time available in this rulemaking. So here I suggest that the Commission not adopt any alternative or additional PIMs that could apply to fuels besides natural gas. I agree with with Public Service that applying a PIM like the EG PIM would not be appropriate for the other fuels. It's very much designed for natural gas commodity. And so if you agree with me, perhaps to clarify this, the overview and purpose of the rules adopted by this decision today should be narrowed to natural gas fuel cost recovery only.
Commissioner Plant,
I agree.
Commissioner Goman,
I also agree.
as
Okay. Now we can turn to that EGPIM. The proposed rules 3862A through C establish the EGPIM. Part A requires the electric utilities to include an EGPIM in their ECA filings. Part B sets a deadline for the utilities to file the necessary tariff sheets to implement the EGPIM into their ECAs. And Part C sets forth that symmetric sharing mechanism that is the centerpiece of the EGPIM. CEC asked the Commission to consider developing an entirely different alternative to the EGPIM. It's one that would be modeled after the energy cost adjustment mechanism for Rocky Mountain Power in Wyoming. Rocky Mountain Power files an annual ECAM application where it requests approval to recover actual energy costs for the preceding calendar year above the net power costs included in base rates as set in a prior general rate case. The difference between the actual and base net power costs is subject to an 80-20 sharing band, where the actual net power costs from the prior calendar year are capped in terms of recovery by Rocky Mountain Power at 80% if they exceed the base net power costs established in the rate case. And conversely, if the actual power costs are below the base rate power costs, 80% of the benefit from that variance is credited back to ratepayers, but the 20% accrues to the shareholders. CEC argues that an ECAM for Colorado would incentivize the utilities to use best efforts to keep fuel costs and power costs at the same base level as in rates. Because they would have to absorb 20% of any amount incurred above that baseline, they will be able to also enjoy an incentive. CEC adds that because electric utilities can control their dispatch decisions, utilities can purchase power, reduce curtailments of renewables, or call on demand resources to affect the reduction in its fuel costs. CEC acknowledges, however, that doing something like this in Colorado would be a sweeping change because it would replace the ECA entirely and would also cause it would also prompt the elimination of the Purchase Capacity Cost Adjustment, or PCCA. But on the plus side, CEC notes that this would address the electricity production cost efficiency aspects of the mandate in 291. In response to this suggestion from CEC, Public Service asked the Commission to recognize that Wyoming uses future test years in setting their base rate cases, so the net power costs included in the base rates are based on forecast measures of what those fuel costs would be. Black Hills states that should the Commission truly wish to develop mechanisms that align the financial incentives of the investor-owned electric utilities with the interest of customers, the Commission should allow the utilities to mark up the cost of gas for generation purposes and eliminate the current pass-through nature of gas costs through the ECA. So this next decision point is really whether to replace the proposed EGPIM with a modified version of the energy cost adjustment mechanism used for Rocky Mountain Power in Wyoming, as suggested by CEC, and possibly that's part of what Black Hills suggests as the elimination of the current pass-through in its comments.
Do you have a recommendation for us?
Sure. I agree with CC that the adoption of an ECAM would be a sweeping change, and therefore I think it's too much to be achieved in this proceeding on this record. I think it would be premature to adopt a rule that supports the elimination of the ECA and PCCA for a new form of base rate making.
Commissioner Plant?
I agree.
Commissioner Goman?
Excited.
I also agree.
As do I.
Okay, so I'm going to move now to the EGPIM, but before I do that, I just want to pause to see if any of the commissioners want to talk about this in light of the GCA discussion that we just had, where there was differentiation between the utilities in terms of what would be applied and when. I can pause, or I can move on to the specific questions here. One of those questions, though, is what is the baseline to use? So what would your preference be?
I think I just go through the issues one by one. Does that work for you guys, Commissioner Plant? Yeah, I see nodding heads. So
Okay.
just let's go through the issues one by one.
Okay, so Public Service wants some clarification about what gas costs are included and subject to the EGPIM. And as we've just discussed for the GCA, in the recommended decision for the GCA rules, there was a process by where there would be individual utility adjudications to sort out these details. So this would address Public Services requesting comments to determine what costs are included in the GPIM, including financial products for such things as gas price hedging. Black Hills states that it has not finalized its position on some of these costs, but it does oppose a framework that does not provide a utility the opportunity or flexibility to address its own unique portfolio attributes. So the question here is, should the commission implement a utility-specific proceeding to determine the exact gas commodity expenditures that would be subject to the EGPIM? And again, I'll point out that a parallel decision point was raised in the GCA rulemaking. There was this utility-specific adjudication to get the GPIM right. I suggest that there be a similar process adopted in these rules for the EGPIM.
Commissioner Plant?
I agree.
Commissioner Goman?
I also agree.
As do I.
The benchmark for the EGPIM is in Rule 3862C1. This is probably the area of most controversy here. Public Service would like to use a current index price benchmark. Public Service proposes rule language to apply a current index derived on daily industry publications. Black Hills suggests that if a benchmark is used, it should be derived from forward market values. Black Hills states that the proposed historic cost benchmark in the NOPR could disallow recovery of legitimate and prudently incurred costs. Black Hills basically echoes what it said in the GCA rulemaking. I think one thing I need to point out is that unlike the GCA, where there is a GPIM in existing rules, there's nothing available now for the electric utilities. So the question here is whether a benchmark for an EGPIM should be changed from the gas rate for the same calendar quarter from the previous year to a generic forward-looking benchmark as suggested by Black Hills, a published monthly index as suggested by Public Service, or something else such as what was adopted in the GCA rulemaking, such as a 3-year average that was adopted for Public Service, And I guess there's now a question of whether Public Service and Black Hills should implement a GPIM that is different for at least a partial period of time.
I think we might have lost the chairman.
Yeah. Were you, Commissioners Plan and Gilman, were you able to hear me through that presentation? Okay, great.
It looks like he's still on.
Oh, is he on?
Name.
There he is.
Sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Commissioner Plant?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if we want to get a recommendation on this. I guess the question is, do we go with the new way that we applied to Excel? Do we keep it the same for everybody? Do we do two different ways in alignment with the GCA? Or will we do something else? I'm not sure what your recommendation is there.
Yeah, let's ask you for a recommendation, Mr. Davis.
Well, I think the best way forward here is to sort out the proper benchmark in adjudications that would apply, one to Public Service and one to Black Hills. This is very different than the GCA question, because as CEC points out, the electric utilities have lots of options in terms of what fuel costs are incurred or not incurred. And I think that having a utility specific review of what kind of benchmark would be used in an EGPIM makes sense. So that would be my recommendation, to have the benchmark be determined in the adjudication. I think the implication for the rules here is that Rule 3862 would be more generic than what is set forth in the NOPR. What is set forth in the NOPR is very much based on the M docket that preceded this rulemaking, where the Hawaii electric mechanism was examined. But I think there's enough record in this case that it warrants a full adjudication for each utility to implement a financial incentive alignment as intended by 291.
Commissioner Plant?
I agree.
Commissioner Gilman?
Thanks, Mr. Davis. I also agree.
As do I.
Well, that's good news because I think that obviates rendering decisions on many of the details regarding things like the cap, the sharing amounts, and the deadband. But we can go forward with those if the commission really wants to narrow the EGPIM question in the future adjudication to two things: what gas costs are covered, and the second thing is the nature of the benchmark. I think you need to know what the benchmark is in order to make sense of the rest of the elements. So I would just simply suggest that the commission not take up those details today in adopting the rule.
That works for me. 3 hours and 15 minutes into this. Commissioner Plant?
I agree.
Commissioner Gilman?
I also agree.
Mr. Davis, anything else?
Yeah, just a couple things. I think we should defer to the future adjudications, the force majeure requests. I don't know whether a force majeure because of gas supply issues is enough to warrant a rule like in the GCA. So I think we should leave that one to a future adjudication. I think this also takes care of the trial period question and the delay. So I think that allows us to go to the very last question, and that is whether the commission wants to adopt a prudency review standard in these ECA rules. The GCA rules have a prudency review standard that's unique in our electric and gas rules. This is an ECA rulemaking. It could be possible, as Public Service suggests, to introduce a similar prudency review standard for the ECA. My recommendation here is that I don't think it's necessary for the Commission to adopt that standard. This ECA rule that's being contemplated in this rulemaking is very narrowly tailored to Senate Bill 291 requirements, and that it was not intended to encompass a comprehensive assessment of the ECA as a cost recovery mechanism.
Commissioner Plant,
I agree.
Commissioner Gomez,
I also agree.
as do I.
Okay, so that takes us through the decision points this morning. So again, I think this could be an ABC decision because it will be significantly editing down the rules in the NOPR and emphasizing a new rule that requires the filing of an application to set forth an EGPIM in each utility's ECA tariffs.
I'm good with an ABC order. Does that work for you, Commissioner Plant?
Yep.
Commissioner Gomez? Anything else on this, Mr. Davis?
No, thank you. Happy New Year.
Yeah. Well, you took both the major orders, ABC, so I think it's us who should be wishing you a happy New Year, Mr. Davis.
Thank you.
Thanks for all your help getting us through this and your team and counsel, Mr. Davis, and to the both of you and everybody out there, happy and healthy New Year. Final thoughts, Commissioner Plant?
Thanks. Same to you.
Commissioner Gelman?
Likewise, same, and see y'all at our next meeting.
Catch everyone in 2025. Be well. Take care.